unions need to aggregate workers and build worker power and leverage it by the strength of numbers, while what we do is more like a work of networking, curation, education, communication, because unions are very bad at speaking to tech workers. In the tech sector, when the CEO is crying because he has to let go 30% of the workforce, everybody's like, hey, poor guy had to make a tough decision, and you imitate that. So that needs to be corrected.
Anti-corporate sentiment is definitely not enough. You can be anti-corporate and still kind of like a shitbag.
The biggest problem with the free software movement for many years was that they wanted to liberate software for the sake of it. Like free software is intrinsically better than proprietary software, and good things are gonna come out of it. Like, no, not necessarily. Like maybe, but not necessarily.
What often happens is like, you have the tech guy comes in and they make a tool, but that like tries to mimic the organization perhaps in some way, but there's never a question of like, well, how do you want to relate to one another? How do you want to like socially structure your organization?
In an absence of structure, in an absence of authoritarian power, if you just create a void, that void is gonna be filled by stuff you probably don't like. Right? It's like fermentation. Like if you just put a carrot on the table and wait, mold is gonna grow in it. Not good stuff.
So, hi everyone, you're listening to the Blockchain Socialist podcast. I'm Josh, and I'm here today with my friend Simone Robutti. He is an ex-software developer and organizational designer and a member of Tech Workers Coalition Global, which is a super interesting group that has been leading a lot of the different, let's say, efforts in kind of bringing the labor movement to the tech industry. So we'll talk a bit about that, but maybe first, Simone, I mean, I already know you, but would you like to give an introduction to the audience?
Hello, everybody. I'm Simone. I am currently based in Berlin. I'm originally Italian, and I've been a software developer for many years. 3 years ago, I decided to quit the for-profit startup environment here in Berlin because I never developed software that was useful for anything. Or even used, like most of it. The startup goes bankrupt, it's over, that's it. I've been a researcher on the social harm of AI and recommender systems in a group called AI Forensics. In between, I also tried to start my cooperative. Didn't work out for personal reasons, so we didn't really start before getting to a bad point. Then I decided to start my new career, let's say. Career maybe is a big word, but like turn the abilities and skills that I gained through political organizing into something more professional. So I support basically political organizations or associations, collectives, micro businesses, cooperatives eventually. For now, I don't have any cooperative client, but that's my ambition to work better, in short. But that means many things. I do facilitation, I do leadership training, I do process design. So I take care of everything they need to be more effective at what they do. I also do no code software development. I'm also open to do proper software development, but more often than not, we don't need new software. That's another thing why I left the industry. I'm like, there's enough software for most things. That's not the bottleneck in most cases. That's why I started this new job that is now my current profession.
Yeah. Maybe we can talk a bit about that. Would love to introduce that organization to the audience and to people who are maybe more involved on the crypto side of the tech world, who maybe don't get exposed to these types of organizations that are centered around labor efforts in the tech industry.
Yes, let's give a bit the standard spiel, then maybe I will move to some more personal storytelling stuff maybe. But Tech Workers Coalition is an international organization that does support the labor organization within the tech sector and political activities within the tech sector. So within the tech industry mostly, but also from the outside in the sense of like cooperative spaces or like political initiatives that are related to technology at large. The main core focus has been over the years raising the amount of tech workers that are part of a union. This means different things in different contexts. So each local chapter, we have many spread over the world, has different strategies to achieve this. But that's the, let's say, the main goal usually. And we have started in 2014 in the USA. I wasn't there. I've been for 2 weeks in the USA. That was enough. And since then, we had arguably a lot of success. Obviously, we cannot claim that the whole tech workers movement is our creation, but a lot of people involved in TWC went on to build very meaningful unions or projects, initiatives, sometimes their own strand of, like, some became researchers, some became more, let's say, proper union organizers within unions or full-time employees of unions. And a lot of the TWC people, if you know the names and you read the news of union efforts, especially in the US, you read the names, and it's like all people that attended TWC events. More likely they were organizers of local chapters or heavily involved in local chapters. Yeah, this is the main idea, let's say.
And so Tech Workers Coalition, what I understand is that it is itself not a labor union.
Yes,
It
it's
is
not.
something else.
Yes, we use the term alt labor. That is not something we invented. It's the idea that traditional unions are not necessarily fit to the challenges of a faster labor market, of a, you know, the current conditions. So they need to be integrated with different kind of activities. And this, when we talk about unions, we are talking about it in the Anglo-Saxon sense of any collective of workers. So bureaucratic big unions with legally recognized and everything, but also more anarchistic grassroots unions are models that were born in a different time and were perfectly fit. They won a lot, but now they need to be integrated with something more, especially in the tech sector that didn't exist when these models were born. So alt labor is the umbrella term for anybody trying to fit into this situation. And so we see ourselves as complementary to unions in the sense that we work with them in local contexts more often than not. But our role, our function within the ecosystem is different. Like, the unions need to aggregate workers and build worker power and leverage it by the strength of numbers, while what we do is more like a work of networking, curation, education, communication, because unions are very bad at speaking to tech workers, like especially in Europe. In the US, it's getting better. But in Europe, they clearly speak different languages. So we try to bridge this with giving training to union organizers that maybe organize car factory workers until the other day, and now they need to speak about quality assurance testers, tech support, or the difference between a sysadmin and a software developer. This kind of stuff, it's critical if you're speaking to a tech worker, but it's not obvious if you're not the, with that background. So we do this kind of stuff. We do also, like, most of what we do is not targeted towards unions, targeted toward the workers. So we educate workers on how to form a union in their legal framework, or also, like, in practice, how to speak to your co-workers, because this is not something you learn by experience if you are in the tech sector. Like, I always say, like, if you are a dock worker, you're 18, it's your first job, you go, you see all these bulky men that when the manager comes and says, I have to do this, I'm sorry, but the superior, they're like, okay, we go on strike, fuck you. They start burning shit. It's this attitude. And when you're 18, you just imitate that and you don't need to
Right.
learn much. In the tech sector, when the CEO is crying because he has to let go 30% of the workforce, everybody's like, hey, poor guy had to make a tough decision, and you imitate that. So that needs to be corrected.
Right.
Practical, emotional, psychological, and cultural and political education to overcome this distorted work culture, let's
Yeah.
say.
Yeah, no, I can imagine that there's at least some difference in more blue collar work where you don't have to go through the university process, which is in itself, for all it's good educating people, also a force for imprinting ideology in people before they go into the workplace. It is like telling you you are so smart for getting into university, you're so good, prime you with a lot of, whether explicitly or not, certain ideas about what work is, how
Mhm.
work should look like, what are the range of things that you can do in certain scenarios or conditions. In particular, if you are imprinted with a kind of business ideology
Mhm.
from 18 to 22 or however old you are, then it becomes a whole lot more difficult when you first into the workforce. You have very little experience. You've been primed with all this ideology that you can't fight for your labor rights. Labor rights are just something that those old
Yeah.
traditional people who don't go to college, they do that kind of stuff.
It's also boring, like at
Proper.
least in Europe, unions are associated with, bureaucracy, legal terms,
Mm,
stuff you have to do, and you don't like you have taxes and you have unions, and they are at least for me, they were in the beginning when I was younger, they were kind of in the same universe of adult stuff I don't understand because
yeah.
I didn't have any example of my parents, for example, or any co-worker or colleague in a university going through a unionization process that is not just
Mm,
legal stuff. It means eating and drinking with your friends when you win a majority vote in the USA, for example. It means a lot of social interaction. It means one passionate speech from the introverted guy that found the strength to speak out under the abuse of the manager, whatever. Like these kind of experiences are not part of your path exactly if you go through university, but even it's something that is lost, but it's becoming common again. To I see new generations, especially outside of tech universities, becoming more open to this kind of narrative. It's not erased anymore, the idea of collective action within the workplace. It's something that in mainstream media is more present in the last 5 to 8 years, I would say, especially American media.
yeah, I've had a lot of interesting conversations with my, say, apolitical friends who about labor union organizing or watch scene in a movie about labor organizing. It's jarring for them, I feel like, just because it's not normalized for
Yeah,
a lot of people who are university educated, that is something you can do. It looks, yeah,
yeah.
alien in many ways. So being able to then, where we have today, where I think a lot of people have been radicalized through the internet in some capacity, and then they realize, oh, labor unions are like good in some way, perhaps, and then they experience the workplace in certain ways, and now all of a sudden you're like, my place could use a union.
Mhm.
What would be the process of that, you think, that is specific to a tech workplace?
So it depends. Like it's hard to make general, reasoning about this because each legal context is very different, and this also translates with very different practices on the ground on how to start unionization. Like in the US is completely different than
Yeah.
in Italy, for example. But I would say that any spark of collective action needs to start with looking your colleagues in the face, take the risk of expressing discontent or collecting discontent from them, and build from there. Like no union
Mm,
starts without that. If you have a bureaucratic union coming in, but there's no, sense of commonality or like shared problems, it doesn't, or shared solidarity doesn't go anywhere. And solidarity is, especially the Americans use it a lot in this very, I don't know. For me, it's very unrelatable, but at the same time, it's the substance on which all of this is built and needs to start being experienced directly. And you start this with conversations with your coworkers. Everything starts there, especially conversations about the fact that things are going a certain way because there's a vertical structure of command, and they can go
mm,
in a different way if we start an initiative of some kind. That's for me
right.
that's the root of any change anywhere, but especially in the workplace. The tech sector is not that different in this regard. The difference is that it's very alien to most people, as we just said, that often don't work in the same physical space. That's another major problem. Like
Mm,
remote work, I'm not against it, obviously, even though there are some union organizers that are like, we should fight remote work because it makes unionization. I'm like, that you're a fucking idiot. Like, no worker will come behind such a logic. Like, let's embrace
Yeah.
it. It's not making things easier, but we need to embrace remote work. Otherwise, we sound the same as managers. But it does pose challenges. So you need to learn how to bring them. For example, these are new practices. You need to understand how to smoothly bring them outside the digital platform, not controlled by the company. Because if you discuss this stuff on Slack, you're fucked immediately. They're gonna find out because most of the chat are surveilled, especially if they think that there are unionization efforts ongoing. So you need to invite them to maybe a Telegram group or a Signal group with an excuse that makes sense or without exposing. This is like a kind of very detailed practice that it's developing these years, because 15 years ago this was the case for a very small portion of the workforce.
Right. So maybe talking a bit about the specifics about what the Tech Worker Coalition has done. Do you have any examples of some actions that people could look up?
Again, this changes a lot on a geographical basis, but in the USA, I would say most of the chapters did huge efforts of networking ongoing struggles. That was the main thing, especially before COVID. After COVID, the in-presence activities lost a bit of traction. Now we are organizing a conference nationwide in the USA, in San Francisco, in October. I think they closed the sale of tickets. Maybe it's just the last few days. Might not be open when the episode comes out, but it's gonna be about labor organizing the tech sector, more on the spicy side, because there are already some conferences like these. The major one is from labor notes, but that's more like institutional, not bureaucratic, but it's a mix. While our is called circuit breakers, if you want to Google it, and it already gives the idea that it's a bit more on the spicy side. Here in Germany, we also organize a major conference of members of works councils of startups in Berlin that attracted like 200 people, something like that. I don't remember the exact. I wasn't involved in that. But so here in Germany, you have this concept of work council that is basically some elected workers that have legal protection to represent the rest of the company in front of the management. And these are not necessarily part of a union. It's a weird third, but it has a lot of traction. Like, there are a lot of startups doing this because it's easier than a union in the USA or in Italy, for example, to form. You're more legally protected. But so there's a lot of people doing this. We have training events for these people, because once you get elected, you want to push worker rights stuff. It's not enough to be compliant with management, so we teach them how to be more effective at what they do. We network them with similar experiences, so we do skills exchange stuff. The community aspect is another thing. Like in Germany, in Berlin, the chapter is at Berlin level. There's a chat with like 500 people involved in organizing to some degree. In Italy, there's a bigger chat, more public, with 1,500 people that are not little numbers for my country. The USA, there's a big Slack where everybody can involve, like all the names that you see in the newspaper forming a union, you then Google it, you then search it in the Slack, and they're there. So they exchange opinions, they exchange practices. We do courses. That's another thing. We did a long list of workshops and courses on how to form a union, or like I give more stuff like how to facilitate a meeting. Like, I don't believe anything meaningful can be achieved if you cannot hold the meeting properly. Like, that's not, like, you're wasting just your time. Or like leadership in democratic organizations. That's another thing. Similar to how you are not taught how to form a union in a university, also not taught how to behave or lead in a organization that is not hierarchical, because you go to work and you have a dictatorship. Like, there's the god king on top, the priest below, and the man until you get to the managers. And if you have none of these, you often don't know how to behave. So we also teach this kind of stuff.
Nice.
Then a lot of stuff that our people were behind were now under the name of TWC. So the boundary sometimes is a bit fuzzy. like a lot of alphabet workers union, or like collective actions in tech or not tech for apartheid that are other identities, then it's TWC people that decide to wear a different hat and mix with other groups to achieve their goals.
Right. The TWC has managed to become kind of like this substrate for either working through it or finding the people at least to spin off into some sort of specific initiative
Exactly.
related to the involvement of tech workers.
Exactly.
Which is another thing that I wanted to talk to you about, is this term, the tech worker. I know you've written about it in your blog before, but I'm curious what you think about this term and whether it's a useful one, considering that tech being in large part knowledge-based work is very, very specific compared to traditional labor unions. It seems like to me are differences between like the various roles of workers, whereas in a tech company you have like different, you have like marketing, and you have people who do project management, people who are software developers, sysadmins. These are all different, but they can all be considered tech workers if they work in a tech company. I'm curious what you think about this identity and maybe what are its pros and cons.
So yeah, this is something that evolved over time. In the beginning, I mean, Tech Workers Coalition was born with a clear idea that whoever works in a tech company is a tech worker. That's the functional definition we use. And we still use it because it makes sense. You want to organize together people that are subject to the same employer power. Like you want to concentrate power to create change in a single place. And there's no point separating engineers from tech support, because it doesn't lead to anything. Actually, history tells us that every time that companies manage to drive a wedge between office workers and factory workers, these made the demands of the factory workers weaker. So we keep this as a fixed point, like we should strive to organize them together.
Or something.
Uber Eats, yes, they are working for the company, for the platform, and they're sure they should be unionized together with the office workers. In theory, this is nice. In practice, it's very hard for several reasons. First of all, because they physically don't meet each other, especially if you're talking about food delivery workers. The programmers are either in Berlin or San Francisco or New York, and the riders are all over the place. So you have local collectives that maybe are unionized in some form, but the programmers are in a very different legal context. This is one issue. The second is more identitarian. If you ask, I don't know, an Amazon warehouse worker if they're a tech worker, they're gonna be like, no, bro, this is no. Like I move stuff with my hands. So this is like, obviously they understand once you explain the concept that it's not that complicated, but they don't. If they read the word, they don't feel this is the case. So if you write tech worker on a flyer, you're gonna get programmers. Already designers kind of start being like, I'm a creative worker, not a tech worker. Okay. So on a communication level, this is a very bad tool. We acknowledge that. The name is Tech Workers Coalition, so we're going to keep it. But we always try to, let's say, complement the usage of this word with different visuals, different aesthetics. Like, this is an actual rule, not technical discussions at general meetings in TWC Berlin. Because people start, we need to discuss the website changes to the website, and then it's but we need to go through Git and blah blah blah, open a pull request, and you lost most of the room. So we have to do this kind of work, because otherwise, like, we need to actively fight towards this engineering bias. In some chapters this is easier than in others, especially in the American chapters you have more diversity. That's what I've seen. It's also something that reproduces it itself. Like if the room is full of women of color working in, I don't know, like creative positions, versus a room full of white dudes talking about Git, obviously this is gonna somehow be a feedback loop. So we try also, I take care of starting new chapters. This is something I try to address from the get-go, like try to get a mix. Like you start with 5 people, they cannot all be programmers. Otherwise, you're never gonna
Mm.
leave this situation of just attracting more programmers.
The only true proletarian computer language is binary. Everything else is bourgeois.
Okay.
Another kind of identity that is often thrown in the mix around this is the one of the hacker.
Mhm.
So the tech worker seems to be giving an alternative to what has traditionally been viewed as the revolutionary subject in the digital economy,
Mhm.
as like the lone hacker who is, Mr. Robot punching away. I like the show Mr. Robot, by the way, even though it is ideological. I don't care. It was good.
Yeah.
Being the one guy who can like code their way into the mainframe and like, somehow make the company implode on itself. Yeah, I guess how do you see these differences, or like what are your critiques of like maybe this
Mhm.
hacker identity?
Yeah, there are many. I also wrote in the past about this. The main issue I have, like, there are two issues, big issues. The first one is how hacker culture conceives change as a sum of individual struggles, and also how it conceives as like this kind of rapture. Like, it's very Christian, like you have the savior that touches the right point and unleash the day of judgment. That's Mr. Robot is like that. Like, there's a
Great
before the
story. A great
apocalypse
story.
and after the apocalypse, like it's a day of judgment.
Yeah.
That's not how societal change happens. And even when you have
Right.
some, let's say, viral exponential phenomena, like it will be the collapse of the digital infrastructure that the conditions that created that potential for virality were the change, not the act itself of like pressing the right button. So the hacker sees like the pressing the button as the change, while anybody with a materialist background, or even not even materialist, but like more systemic understanding of society, does understand that there are preconditions to any change, and every change is incremental to some degree, even if it presents with exponential symptoms. But they're just a symptom, it's not the cause. The tech worker is focused on collective action that can impact the totality of the tech industry. Like, we want to bring change of, like, obviously on an international level, because it's impossible to avoid that, but more like on the core relationship between workers and employers, and take control of how technology is made. The second problem I have with hacker identity is aesthetic, if you want, where you have these, first of all, again, individualistic, but also it's the hero journey. It's like, or martyrdom sometimes. It's not the vibe we cultivate. Like, we want this to be a sustained effort, and collaborative, obviously. So beyond the actual theory of how to bring change in the workplace, it's also how emotionally you should relate to it. Like, this is something that needs to be done together, because alone you don't hold enough power, regardless of how many things you know. Knowing things and changing big things with your code might feel good, but it just gets you, at some point you might have to let go and acknowledge that your technical expertise is not enough to change the world. And so any aesthetic or like narrative that reinforces this idea is kind of a bit of a problem. That said, in some contexts, we try to cultivate some level of intermingling with the most progressive parts of the hacker movement. Speaking about the hacker movement or hacker scene in 2024 is a bit weird, because a lot of it has been
Yeah.
co-opted by corporate. Like, you have hackers within you have growth hackers in companies, and like,
Right.
you're just making
Right.
money. Like, you're not different from, a finance bro in New York. Like, you're just, but you call yourself hacker. So obviously this is not what, hacker clubs will recognize as an hacker, but still,
Yeah.
especially I would imagine in San Francisco, I've never been there, but I would imagine there the line is very fuzzy. Like, you have Elon Musk that used to go to these hacker spaces while he already had a lot of money, or like he was already Elon Musk at the time. So,
Yeah.
and this is not by chance. Like, the hacker ethos is the same of the startup ethos in California. Like they have same root in the 70s and 60s, 70s counterculture. Don't want to go on an historical rant here, but it's not by chance. And yeah, so we try, but at the same time, this whole logic is losing traction on younger generations, at least from my perspective. I remember university, it was much more cool to contribute to free software. There was a lot more optimism on the potential of all of this, even though I'm not that old. It was kind of already showing plenty of cracks, but now I feel like a lot of young people are disillusioned with the political potential of this. And if they do it, it's more similar to what you were describing of like going on a prescribed path. Now any respectable developer needs to contribute to open source projects, but the political element is lost. You're just contributing free labor that eventually is gonna fuel some startup or some military device somewhere, but the freedom of people, thanks to the freedom of software, is not part of the equation anymore. So yeah, that's my perception.
Yeah, no, I think I definitely agree with a lot of that. It's the hacker ethos was definitely like very easily co-optable into capitalism. I think there is definitely a lot of anti-capitalist sentiment inside its aesthetic and ideas around it. But because it didn't strike at kind of like the core of what are the issues within capitalism and its hierarchies and power relations in a more systemic way, I mean, I think it touched it in some ways where I think hacker ethos, like there is a side of it, especially in the beginning, that was very anti-corporate, but anti-corporate sentiment is definitely not enough. You can be anti-corporate and still kind of like a shitbag.
I mean,
So I
that's
think that
the
was,
startup discourse in many ways. It's like
yeah.
we are disrupting the corporate. IBM is boring and old. We are young and cool. And
We're
then
Google.
you have Facebook, and then you have Meta,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
then you have Peter Thiel. Like that's not. I mean, Peter Thiel maybe now is corporate, but you get the point.
Yeah, it's kind of been a turned into a kind of a more petty bourgeois like thing. But I mean, I say this with like also at the same time all the love for all my friends who consider themselves to be hackers, who are like cracked developers and whatever else. Because I think there is still this like all these criticisms, at least for me, I don't know how you feel, but are not to say that like stop developing software,
Mhm.
all tech, just like go and onto the streets, it doesn't matter. Like it's not
No,
a critique of the craft,
yeah.
I would say.
Also,
I think the craft is too important.
I contribute to free software in my spare time, so I'm guilty as charged. But also, I'm kind of making an extremization, a caricature of the hacker. In practice, there are very few people. I mean, there are still a lot that kind of matches this, but most hackers I meet that identify as an hacker are slowly departing from this logic and trying to integrate. There are plenty of
Yeah.
hackers here in Berlin. I talk to them and they're like, "Yeah, I'm reading Tony Negri," and I'm like, "Okay, that's the total opposite of what of hacker ethos." So there is a transition happening to some degree, um, and it's not against developing technology. It's like the core for me. The core problem is believing that technology is enough, but it doesn't
Yeah.
mean you don't need technology to create societal change. Actually, I think we need better technology. We need to focus on that. I criticize the optimism of the early free software movement that was like, if you liberate the software, any kind of software, whatever it is for, then society is going to be better. Also, this was lacking any concept of power relations. Yeah, the free software movement lost because Microsoft and Apple were making more money with desktop computers, and free software couldn't be placed on any desktop computer for a decade. Like GNU Linux or whatever then changed it, but yeah, it was like an academic thing for a few enlightened
Hmm.
people until it was too late, and because there was no power analysis that told them like you're kinda operating in conditions that will never allow this to be hegemonic. But yeah.
Right. I think in the crypto world in particular, there is maybe higher than average identification with the hacker
Mhm.
ethos in that everything is open source, more or less. All of the back end code is open source, more or less. But then you have perhaps as well, like maybe it feels like a bit of a dark forest in the crypto sphere if you're talking about different decentralized finance applications and whatever else, where people, they literally can be an individual who spot a bug in the code and then can siphon off a shit ton of money. I mean, that's black hat hacking, and of course there are plenty of white hats as well, but it is a space where it is like a bit of the Wild West. The hacker and the cowboy are a little bit, I think, have a lot of overlap.
Yeah.
Hacker is kind of like the digital cowboy in some ways.
Yeah, there are books about this, but I'm not gonna talk about. But yeah, do we want to get into the discussion on how the ethos of the frontier of the Wild West is still alive? Like Elon Musk going to Mars is exactly the same. It's the same logic of the early days of the internet. Internet was the new digital frontier. The blockchain space, to some degree, is prey to this narrative.
The new digital frontier.
Kinda, yes. But like for me, as somebody not participating into it, I have zero visibility of what's happening there as much as a European in Britain would understand what's happening in the United States in the late 18th century, you know? Like I hear stories about it. I know wild stuff is happening there. There's a lot of money to be made. It's exactly the same narrative. And I don't know from within, but from the outside is kind of the same. And yeah.
I kind of wanted to touch on, because we were talking about, free and open source software. At least my view of it is that, not all free and open source software is like a useless thing to do or like is bad or however you want to frame that. But one of the things that has frustrated me a little bit in watching kind of, I don't know if you want to call it the tech left movement or whatever, is the potential for the use of free and open source software as a tactic. So like my kind of the thing that I get annoyed with a lot of tech critics is that, it's like, sure, tech won't save us. Duh. Like to me, that's not like a new idea. This is like obvious, not to be rude or mean about it, but at the same time, we can't ignore like the tools that people need to use to extend themselves to project like counterpower. And that's what like tech workers are built. That's what they do. Like they can build tools for people. And of course, we can criticize maybe the way that of how they build the tools and what tools they're building and for what purpose. I think that's the realm of like kind of where discussion should be, but not like we shouldn't build on things. One of the things just for me is like, why not? I would think, and maybe I'm completely wrong about this, but I would think that putting efforts towards getting people to learn Linux, one of the Linux like operating systems, or like just make, and it is kind of becoming a little bit more normal, kind of ironically coming from, I think Steam, the company has like pushed this a lot, but getting Linux into more computers to break the kind of like Microsoft, the chokehold of Microsoft and Apple. But yeah, this is like it's not like something I've really seen very much in the tech worker space. I think in part, maybe there's still a slight contradiction in the labor movement. I support it completely, but at the same time, if we start a labor union within Microsoft, like that can be good because you can, you have then a power to not only improve working conditions or conditions of everybody extended from their software that they build or hardware or whatever else, but also like there is a little bit of an incentive for people to use Microsoft products because that funds the labor union of Microsoft as well to some degree. I don't know if these are like some kind of like hard questions that I've been thinking about. I don't think there's any easy answer to, but
there's no easy answer, but there is a complex answer that I can try to give. The first point, yes, it is true that the workers' coalition in general, or like whoever identifies as a tech worker, keeps this as secondary. When I have to explain this thing, I always say that the conflict with big tech hinges on three different spaces or three different fronts, let's say. The internal front, so what tech workers coalition does, like from within the companies, create change within the company and change the harm that is done from the inside. Then you have the second front, that is people addressing this from the outside. So regulators, civil society, researchers. It's also what I was doing until a few months ago. Any kind of advocacy or education on how to use technology in a more mindful way. So this is happening outside the tech companies, often against them, sometimes in association with them, but it's like this. And then you have a third front that is independently from big tech. So you have hackers or free software developers. Not all of them like to be called hackers. So let's say software developers in general that want to build a different system of technology at different levels. So from operative systems or firmware to web applications, like it doesn't matter where, but you provide tools that operate by different logic. And also I will incorporate into these like cooperatives. Like there are obviously some cooperatives that participate in the same system. They give consultancy on Microsoft tools. They are more democratic inside, but they don't bring meaningful change to the ecosystem. But then you have cooperatives that offer, for example, cloud services on a small scale to other cooperatives at a discounted price, and they're competing on the market. They are competing against Amazon. Obviously their offer is different, they bundle together different applications, whatever. But if you look from a high level perspective, they're competing with Amazon or with the AWS, with Hetzner, with Google Cloud, and so on. And so this is like a separate system that tries to thrive under different logic, but ultimately, money is money. In the same system, you have to eat, you have to buy stuff at the supermarket. So at some point they kind of interact. And technology, like technological development in this third sense, can be like, it is important, but it need to be predicated on what you were saying. Like you need to do it for a purpose. And I think like the biggest problem with the free software movement for many years was that they wanted to liberate software for the sake of it. Like free software is intrinsically better than proprietary software, and good things are gonna come out of it. Like, no, not necessarily. Like maybe, but not necessarily. So now I see in the last, let's say, 5 years, more or less, a lot of free software, so or open source software, so under this kind of licenses, that is still is playing a different game. Like they are trying to build tools for specific people, for specific contexts, that are somehow liberating. Again, the cooperative ecosystem of technology is growing. If today you want to start a cooperative and offer cloud services, you install Co-op Cloud, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You don't have to start from scratch or adopt proprietary software to do this. And there's a lot of new tools that allow you to do stuff that before could have been done only with proprietary software. This is good. The fact that you can have a whole stack independent from profit logic. Let's be ambitious. Today, can you run a computer built on software only, devoid of for profit logic? Kinda. Linux might be ambiguous in this, but beyond that, you can kind of do it. The problem is that the development is relatively cheap compared to the adoption. So when you were saying we should push for Linux to be adopted, this gives meaningful autonomy and liberation of people if a lot of people are using it. Otherwise, it's tactical autonomy. If I am organizing something very spicy, I don't have Microsoft spyware in my computer by default, but they need to put a lot more effort into spying on me, let's say. This is tactical. This is not liberation per se. And the incentives to adopt Linux are not yet there. And that's the same limit of the free software movement. They expected, it comes with better privacy, it comes with better license, it comes with less implication. No, you need to offer a better product, no matter what. That's how the vast majority of people operate. And if you leverage your adoption of self-sacrifice on availability of time, people don't have the material time to learn new things. Even if they are on the same level of complexity of Windows, they come out of middle school, they can use Windows. And to change those acquired patterns is going to take them time. And this is not going to be addressed by technology. No way. You need to give different incentives. You need to introduce, for example, I really appreciate those collectives that help you set up your Linux computer. That does something. Or like here in Berlin, there is a collective that recuperates old computers. They install Linux on it and they hand them out to refugees or like old people and whatever, but they come with tech support. Like if you cannot open your email, they help you with that. And this is social, this is not technological. And it's also the relationships you have. It's not just the information you get. You can make a video on YouTube explaining this, but it's not going to go anywhere. You have social relationships, the people that teaches you a new way to employ technology. That needs to grow. Otherwise we don't go anywhere. So when you move from tactical, like I want technological autonomy in my organization because I don't want, I don't know, Facebook to ban me and lose all my followers and I cannot promote my products anymore, to strategic, free software is liberating people, the gap is very big. And I'm not saying it shouldn't be done, but it cannot be done naively.
No, yeah, I mean, I definitely don't see it as like, I definitely also see it as like a tactical thing, but a fairly, I guess, yeah, a fairly potentially important one. It definitely involves way more social work to make that happen. It's not like about building the best software once you have the software at a certain point. And I feel like we're reaching that point. We were talking the other day, like you can game on Linux now. Like I feel like that's like a huge opening for people.
Yep.
That was a big that was for me when I was younger. I remember I was like, if I can't game on on a Linux, then it's like pretty difficult to convince me. Now that we have that, there are still like definitely creative tools I think are missing on Linux stuff. It really depends, of course, on the profile of person, but then there's like, yeah, I don't know, maybe work on trying to push schools and like these institutions that end up becoming like a lot of people's first time with interacting with technology to get them to do Linux. There are definitely efforts doing that. I know that in places, especially in the global south, they do use Linux as like the operating system that people learn, because like you have to pay Microsoft oftentimes in order to get the licenses from them, and they will sometimes push as a operating system to get their operating systems for free into these places, but then it comes with all these strings attached. So one of the last things I want to talk to you about is about your organizational consulting, especially for groups like Tech Worker Coalition and other kinds of groups that aspire to be horizontal and in some capacity less hierarchical. If you have any principles that you carry with you for organizing in a more horizontal way, these are, of course, like I think pertinent to crypto people who still believe in the vision, decentralized, autonomous organizations. I think a lot of people, my learning from that is, like we mentioned before, a lot of people just don't know how to organize in a decentralized way. It is like just a different way of relating to people. And so people, I think, had this aspiration for being decentralized, and however they kind of projected that to mean. And then a lot of people got burnt out by it. But I think it's because a lot of people went into it without real principles in mind.
Yeah, I also wouldn't say it's just principles. It's also complex. It's like horizontal, like democracy is harder. Like it's a earlier investment of coordination, energy, and horizontal structures are informationally more complex. Like the circulation of information from a system theory or cybernetic point of view is more and more complex, and it's like even if you design by the right principles, it has a cost on the organization is more, but it enables certain traits and values that otherwise are lost. So democratic organizations tend to be more resilient because you have more circulation of information, you can react to the external environment maybe in a more swift way. But if this investment ends up killing the organization in the early stages, your activity doesn't matter. Like you need to get stuff done, and if it's poorly structured, it doesn't work. So my work mostly consists on reducing these costs and these frictions by employing either established models like I'm not inventing much here. Like we sociocracy for coordination when there is, it's a full-time work environment, or otherwise more lightweight models. Because one hard learned lesson of my last 5 years is that sociocracy doesn't work if you contribute 4 hours a week to a voluntary organization. It has a minimum threshold. I'm assuming your listeners are familiar with sociocracy, but maybe not. Sociocracy is a relatively common organizational model in cooperatives or horizontal structures that is different from a DAO in principle. Like you have a clear idea, relational coordination between units. So you have these circles that need to have explicit relationships within each other, and it's not really contractual. So it's more like an ongoing process of information exchange and responsibility adjustments to adapt to different challenges. I'm not going to go in detail, but if you want to look it up, there's a lot of documentation. There's a famous book, Many Voices, One Song, explaining the model. And it's very commonplace. The other thing I do is to design organizations and software together. Like in many spaces, especially traditional bureaucratic spaces, you try to build the software for the organization that already exists. And so you reproduce the problems you had when information traveled by horse. And a lot of organizations, big organizations, but even tech companies sometimes still operate with that kind of information structure, information flow. On the contrary, you have techno chauvinists that like, this is the perfect tool. They don't have the company like, we're going to use Notion. We're going to use, I don't know, Monday. We're going to use, I don't know, a chatbot to coordinate. And no, bro, like that's not how it works. And so the organization grows around 1, 2, 3 softwares, and people start hating technology because it just doesn't fit what they have to do on a daily basis. So I try to do the two things together. I transform the organizational structures and the software they're using at the same time, because I can work on both sides. That's my pitch, elevator pitch. I can do both.
Sold.
That said, you were saying like most people get into these organizations without clear, maybe with like what I see usually is like a naive optimism of like, if we do stuff decentralized, they're gonna be democratic and I'm gonna have my space. No.
Right.
In an absence of structure, in an absence of authoritarian power, what, like, if you just create a void, that void is gonna be filled by stuff you probably don't like, right? It's like fermentation. Like if you just put a carrot on the table and wait, mold is gonna grow in it, not good stuff. If you put it in the right, brine, then lactofermentation is gonna happen and it's gonna taste good. And it's not like industrial processing where you sanitize everything, you kill everything that exists. This is like the corporate pyramid in organizational terms. It's something more negotiated with the bacteria, but then the good stuff grows. So democratic organization is the same. You need to create the right conditions for people to thrive. It doesn't happen by itself. The other comparison I usually do is like teenage sex. If there is love, then the sex is gonna be that's not how it happens. And the same is like, if there is assemblies, then everything's gonna be good. Or if there are DAOs, everything's gonna be good. The change needs to happen in many levels: organizational, cultural, spiritual, emotional. Like if you are always angry and you let it out in your workplace, democratic workplace, you're just gonna make the space toxic, and you need to solve your issues. It's not the organization needs to limit this, but it's like in a structured corporate environment. What you do, you cannot express those emotions at work. You go in the bathroom and cry. In a democratic space, we try to avoid that, but that is very complicated and expensive. And so if you don't do it properly, that kind of energy that normally goes into crying to the bathroom goes into the assembly, and it creates problems for us.
Right.
So I try to teach a new way of leadership that is also emotional to some degree. Like if the members of your organization are upset or unhappy or whatever, they have the power to turn this into a problem for everybody. And so you want to address that too, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I work from home and cry usually.
Well, that's maybe therapy, but I work alone and I cry. No.
I
This
cry as I type.
okay. If you like, emotional care is part of the deal. Like you cannot do
Sure.
it.
Definitely. I think, yeah, and this element of emotional care is especially in particular lost in hierarchical organizations. Like it's not like it's treated through just more, I mean, also explicit relationships where this person is above you and what they say is like what you got to do,
Mhm.
and that's it, or you lose a job.
Yeah.
you know Whereas in more horizontal organizations, that's a bit more complicated, in like potentially a very good way, in like a way that like you can feel a lot more whole in like the work that you do and like your relationships with your coworkers. But it is something that takes practice for sure.
Mhm.
um, and I thought it was interesting that you mentioned that you do, both the social side and the technological side.
Mhm.
um, that like I mean, I find that like super interesting, and it's like a great set of skills to be able to do both. Just because I think what often happens is like, you have the tech guy comes in and they make a tool,
Yeah.
but that like tries to mimic the organization perhaps in some way, but there's never a question of like, well, how do you want to relate to one another? How do you want to like socially structure your organization? And so like kind of from the way to view things is like, when like technology is social, like there's like this very common thing where people either, I'm a tech guy, or I'm like, oh, I'm not a tech guy. I talk to people, as if they are like two distinct things that don't overlap with one another. But in fact, technology facilitates the social relationship, so it's important to like think through that.
Yeah.
um, but I guess when you're specifically thinking about the building of technology, do you have any thoughts or principles and like how you do that with this in mind?
Yeah, I have my secret wet dream theory of change that I never actually wrote down, but it relates to a lot of the topics we touched. So maybe I will talk about it. That if we were saying like how democratic organizations are harder to do and they have certain frictions, and that might kill them, my effort is to reduce this. Software is part of the equation, and the software that is produced nowadays doesn't necessarily work in that way. Like there's encoded in Slack, there's nothing to facilitate this structure, for example. But there is one incidental exception, in my view, that is not designed for this, but kind of mimics what we need, let's say. And so I became a big fan of no code software development. That if you don't like, maybe this word is going around a bit, maybe not in all bubbles, but let's frame it like no code software is software that allows you to produce other software without producing code. And there's a
Mm.
huge range of what you can do with this, from mobile apps with drag and drop to other new ways of producing software. So the point is that a lot of these tools erase the necessity for skilled programmers. That doesn't mean programmers are going to be unemployed because there is this stuff. They cover very different use cases, and they cover exactly those use cases where you want the developer to be also the user. So we did at least some of these tools. I'm thinking, for example, about Notion or Airtable or Zapier, or like these relatively simple tools compared, for example, Bubble.io that takes weeks to make a drag and drop menu. Now, maybe I'm just bad, but still, it's much more complicated. Um, these tools, if you adopt them in a democratic setting, it means that who is subject to the tool because they have to use it is also enabled to change it. Obviously, with some supervision, it's not like everybody can change every single button you're using or every single database, because that becomes a nightmare. But in theory, you don't need to involve an external person to make this change. And this reduction of friction will empower small organizations, because big organizations can change their software. They have the money to do it. Small organizations, decentralized organizations that tend to be a aggregation of actual independent organizational units, can do this more easily with little research, little study. So I'm thinking of a scenario where, for example, I use Notion extensively, to alter the way you keep your contacts, CRM of all your contacts in your organization. If you have to do it with an established tool, you need to, even if it's open source. So this is not a matter of code control. It's open source. You need to write a Python module that does change this, or do a pull request, or do a fork. You get crazy. You're just end up not gonna. You're just not gonna do it. If it's a tool Notion and you want to add the column, I don't know, second email. For now, you just have one email, but some contacts have two emails. You want to add the second email field. It takes 3 minutes, 2 minutes, and that's it. And this friction enables the software to mold itself around the organization much better. And it's not going to happen with programmers in the loop, because even if you have a programmer within your organization, you have to ask, make a ticket, say, I would to add this email thing. Then it's like, no, in the future, this might create problems. We need to discuss. Let's have a meeting, and it doesn't happen. So these micro frictions are a huge source of frustration for users, because the software is not specific. It's not tailor-made for their use case. Because it's reasonable, for example, to have one email contact, but some people need two, and those few people are fucked by the existing CRMs. It's an example. I don't know. But this is my theory of change. They introduce these tools within organizations and empower people to do the changes themselves, so they can do without me. This is not a great business strategy. I'm making myself redundant, but it doesn't matter because nobody else is doing this. So I hope I can go for a while. But this is the whole point, and this is empowering. This is democratic because you are more in control of your software. The idea that there's another problem with hacker culture. The idea that if the code is open, then you're in control of it, it's bullshit. Most people don't have the time or knowledge to do it. A lot of software that I can touch because I have the skills, I'm just not gonna spend 1 week to change one feature unless it's really critical to my job. I'm just gonna do it if it's very important. While with this new paradigm, somehow this friction is gonna disappear, or at least be reduced to the point where software is gonna be more usable. And the big problem is that the free software movement is a bit lagging behind on these kind of tools. So there is some software that does this, but for example, AppSmith or NoCoDB. But for example, there's no alternative to Notion that is free software, at least that is comparable in features. So yeah, that's my thing.
Shout out to my friends at Fileverse. They're building something similar to Notion, maybe worth checking out, but definitely building their way towards the same types of features that Notion has. Some pretty interesting, cool stuff. It's a bit more crypto specific, where you sign in with your wallet. But yeah, I do think if I were to guess so many years ago that Notion would be this big, I wouldn't have taken it seriously.
Mm-hmm.
But it has become way more useful than I thought it would have been previously.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, it's also, I don't know, after all these discussions about proprietary software, big tech, whatever, I'm a Notion fanboy, and I have to reconcile the fact that they developed something very new and very good in every regard, but then they are a big corporate.
Sure.
So I have to, even when I go to meetups, everybody is a fanboy of the product, but they end up being a fanboy of the company, and it's also a bit cultish, I would say, but I'm part of the cult, so whatever. But it's hard to reconcile this, because I also like, should I bring people on Notion or not? Because I'm going against what we see today. But until the free software provides, we have to stick with it.
Yeah. I think it's a matter of appreciating the product, critical of the company. Is perhaps is generally the way that I try to balance myself whenever. Yeah, what ends up happening is VC may fund and then create a good product, which then some hacker, wink wink, could reverse engineer all those things into a free and open software.
Anytype is doing that. It's at the moment the main alternative to Notion. It's not free software. It's source available, but they're kind of getting there. So it's doable. At least they showed it's doable. I'm also trying to gaslight the main developer of Bonfire to do a federated Notion, basically. The
Uh-huh.
effort is not going great because it's some years of his life, so Notion is not a trivial software, but I'm working on it.
Nice. Well, thanks so much for coming on, man. It was great. I'm sure we will speak again sometime in the future, since we only touched a fraction of a lot of your work. But maybe just to end it off for people, where can they keep up with you and your work?
Yeah, so
Yep.
I have some blogs that are not really active these days because I started publishing on Notion. That's another thing. I publish a bit everywhere. If you want to, I have a website, robutti.me. You can also write me an email if you want to stay in touch at simone@robutti.me. You find me on Instagram. I post mostly my political stuff there on and off. And I'm Simone Robutti on Instagram, so always same. And yeah, otherwise, if you are in Berlin, hit me up. We can go out for a beer. That's how I met Josh the first time, I guess.
Cool. You're gonna get flooded with DMs
That's
for
fine.
beer dates. All right. Thanks so much.
Thanks to you. Have a nice day, everybody.